Our discussion today will be guided by ISS Regional Director Lauriane Théroux-Bénoni. Dr. Théroux-Bénoni is the Director of the ISS Regional Office for West Africa, the Sahel, and the Lake Chad Basin. She leads a team of researchers based in Dakar, Bamako, Abidjan, Abuja, and N'Djamena. The office works on key policy issues in the region, such as violent extremism and terrorism, political instability, local conflicts, peace operations, and political processes. Prior to joining the ISS in 2012, she worked as a researcher with the Network on Peace Operations at the University of Montreal, Radio-Canada, and the Carter Center in Côte d'Ivoire. Lauriane, over to you.
Thank you very much for the floor. It is a pleasure to be chairing this panel today. 10 years after the creation of the GCTF, it's worth noting that the forum's initial objectives are still central to CT efforts, and allow me to state those that have just been mentioned, two key objectives in my view, which are strengthening civilian-led international counterterrorism cooperation and making the international architecture more effective in addressing the evolving threat of terrorism. I think we will all agree that recent development around the globe, and I can think of the Sahel, I can think of Afghanistan and also Mozambique, these recent developments serve as important reminders of the work that still remains in reaching these objectives and the importance of questioning perhaps not only our responses, but also our understanding of the threat that we are facing. Against that background, it is my privilege to chair this panel personally, but also from an institutional perspective on behalf of the Institute for Security Studies. And I think this panel will allow us to both take stock of the impact of this forum, but also to discuss and make recommendations on the way forward. I am pleased to be with four panelists, four colleagues that will engage on specific issues. Allow me to first turn to Eric. Eric is Senior Associate Fellow at the Royal United Service Institute, RUSI, in London. Eric, how would you describe the impact of the GCTF on multilateral counterterrorism, on the multilateral counterterrorism architecture since its inception in 2011? Over to you, Eric.
Thank you, and thank you to the GCTF Co-Chairs for including me in this important discussion. I think the first point I would mention or note is that in 2011, when the GCTF was launched, the multilateral architecture for counterterrorism was rather limited and stale, if you will. There weren't really many opportunities for practitioners to engage with each other in a sustained basis. And there really weren't opportunities for countries in the global north to engage on counterterrorism dialogue with countries in the global south. And I think what you've seen with the GCTF is catalyzing a shift away from that rather rigid, state-centric, global north-dominated approach into a much more global, multi-dimensional one. And I think the GCTF can certainly take a lot of credit for that. And I think it spurred the UN into, for lack of a better phrase, to get its act together on these issues. And in fact, I think a lot of the progress that the UN has made has been informed by, since then, has been informed by how the GCTF has gone about its business starting 10 years ago. And I think this emphasis on practitioner exchanges, dialogues, networking is really something the GCTF has, I wouldn't say pioneered, but was certainly ahead of the curve on. And I would also argue that as a result of this, a number of countries have been able to take an active leadership role in global counterterrorism issues, whether it's Morocco, whether it's Algeria, whether it's Nigeria, whether it's Qatar, UAE, all these countries in the Indonesia, all these countries in the GCTF from the quote unquote global south have played a really tremendous leadership role in the GCTF, and I think that's translated also to being much more engaged multilaterally in general on these issues, and that's good for everyone. So I would argue that those are some of the key things that the GCTF has inspired in terms of movement in the multilateral architecture, and I look forward to continuing the conversation.
Thank you very much, Eric, for this. And you actually mentioned the UN and how the GCTF has managed to put pressure on the UN. I'd like to now turn to David. David is the Chief of Branch at the United Nations Security Council Counterterrorism Executive Director at CTED. And I'd like to ask you, David, perhaps how has the work of the GCTF contributed to the work of the UN Security Council over the past decade?
Thank you, Laurie, and thank you to the GCTF for inviting CTED to join this important panel. I would say that the contribution of the GCTF to the work of the United Nations Security Council and vice versa started from day one. And actually, I often describe these relations as a virtuous cycle where oftentimes the GCTF brings new ideas and new challenges and new practical solutions to that member states find. They find themselves somehow in a Security Council resolution, then being handed over or offered to the GCTF to take it to the next level. And clearly the most important aspect of this cooperation over the past decade was the challenge of FTFs, where we could have seen the GCTF not only identifying the challenge, but also bring key elements of practical solutions, then taken up by the Council in Resolution 2178 and 2396. And then, as we could have seen today, handed back to the GCTF for further development. And today, this committee looks at the watch listings, good practice that is basically an outcome of Resolution 2396, or the good practices on CFT and civic space, which is an outcome of Resolution 2462 of the Council. So basically what we're seeing is very synergetic relations between the work of the Council and the work of the GCTF. From CTED angle, the relations are very natural. Resolution 2395 that embedded CTED mandate calls us to cooperate and to support the work of the GCTF, and we are very happy to do it. Very often we rely on the good practices in development of our assessment tool, our methodological tool, and our analytical tool. And probably the best example in this regard is the joint hands-in-hands work with the GCTF on battlefield evidence. Again, another Resolution 2178 and 2396 highlighted it, but CTED and GCTF worked very, very closely in developing what has now become the Abuja guidelines and what is in CTED called the battlefield evidence guidelines. We even hired the same consultant and benefited tremendously from the work of the IIJ GCTF Inspired Institute. I think I'll stop here, even though I can talk a lot more about the cooperation and synergy between the two bodies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David, for this. I think these are a very concrete example of what has been done and how impactful this cooperation could be. I think it's also important to discuss the challenges, and let me turn to Eric again on that point. Could you perhaps share with us how you see the main challenges that the GCTF has faced over the past decade?
Well, I think there are a few that are sort of lingering. One is the challenge of being a global platform that's trying to really influence local practice. And I think it's translating a lot of these good practice documents that are often developed in order to achieve consensus across the 30 members, and thus the level of specificity, the level of detail is often less than maybe would be ideal for local practitioners. And then local practitioners have to do something with the documents. And I think the GCTF is still learning how to best facilitate the cascading down of these frameworks into the local actors. And I think there are a number of ways that could be overcome. I think it's starting to do that. It starts by having more local perspectives in the GCTF from the beginning, so that the frameworks are much more informed by the local practice at the outset, as opposed to just handing the document over to local actors to then take forward. And I think that, that's a key issue. It's not just for the GCTF, it's also for the wider UN, of course. And it's building these partnerships with local actors and really taking advantage of the informality that the GCTF was supposed to offer to allow for a less rigid platform than perhaps the UN is, or other intergovernmental bodies are, to allow for civil society, to allow for city officials, mayors to be at the table more regularly, more consistently, not just as a speaker at a workshop, but in a formulation of practices and policies. And so I think that for me is the number one challenge. And then a second one is now ensuring its continued relevance in a multilateral counterterrorism architecture that's littered with actors now. There's really been just a intensity of new actors in the field, and there's not a lot of thought given often to how they interrelate with each other, whether they're synergistic, whether they're redundant. And I think particularly now with the UN being so expansive in what it's doing in the counterterrorism space, I think the GCTF is really going to have to identify its comparative advantages and play to those comparative advantages going forward.
I think these are important challenges and already taking us into looking at the way forward. Perhaps now back to David, who highlighted the impact that the cooperation between CTED and the GCTF has generated. I'd like to hear from you, David, about where you see opportunities, and they can be in terms of activities or thematic areas of work where the GCTF and CTED could strengthen their relationships over the next decade.
Thank you, Laurie. I'll start from the point that Eric has stopped, where he asked the question on whether synergy or redundancy. And I'm a firm believer in synergy as far as it relates to the relations between GCTF and CTED, or more broadly with the UN. I mentioned the battlefield as an example that we were deeply involved and saw the synergy between what we're developing and what the GCTF is developing. But there are numerous such examples where the Council provides resolutions or that are very thin in words and very complex to implement. The Council can speak, as I said, on battlefield evidence. It could speak about prosecution strategies. It could speak about API PNR. It could speak about watch listings or biometrics. For us at CTED, that immediately means that we need to provide immediate practical advice to member states on how to implement and to develop methodology on how to assess them. We have, as I said, very strong cooperation, mandate for cooperation in our resolution, and the partnership with the GCTF allows us to work closely with it on developing such practical advice. Where do I see a potential for deepening cooperation? I will highlight perhaps 3 points. First, CTED has a strong mandate on identification of trends and challenges, and we would love to deepen our cooperation with the GCTF on this. We have, of course, a deep focus on Africa in our assessment and facilitation of technical assistance, and we would like to deepen the cooperation with the 2 working groups of the GCTF. Not that it's not happening, but perhaps we have more ways to support this continent. And lastly, I would like to see more natural cooperation between co-chairs of working groups in the GCTF and co-chairs of working group at the Global Compact. Don't get me wrong, we have a semi-annual meeting, which is very useful, and we just attended one last week. But I would like to see ongoing, continuous cooperation between these two entities, thus allowing each other to benefit from the latest of what's happening in the other, and perhaps to join forces in new ways that we don't see yet. Thank you.
David, you actually mentioned an important point about how it's important to collaborate across level, but also share experience across the board and even in different contextual circumstances. This leads me to ask you how you see currently the GCTF position in the multilateral counterterrorism architecture, and where do you see it evolving?
So, in general, I would say that taking what could be an arbitrary point in time, 10 years, 20 years, or 15 years, to assess the contribution of a body runs the risk of missing points in time that exactly don't fit with the calendar, but have shown that this body is critical to the city architecture. And as I said, for me, the most important point in time is not today, 10 years from the foundation of the GCTF, but actually 2014, when ISIL took Mosul and the international community was completely mobilized to find responses to these challenges as soon as possible. And that for me was the critical point in time where the GCTF stood to the challenge. Now, thankfully, it doesn't seem right now at this 10 years anniversary that we are in this point in time, but it could be a year from now, and it could be 2 years from now. And that function of the GCTF is something that I think we need all to understand. It includes 30 member states and all the P5 members and many of the donor states and many of the countries that are top priorities in when it comes to terrorism. So the ability to mobilize this body when it's needed, and hopefully it won't be needed, is something that we need to retain and cherish. This for me is the way I see the GCTF as a tool within, as Eric mentioned, a growing and crowded architecture. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think it's also Eric who highlighted that building partnership with local actor and civil society was a key dimension of the work of the GCTF. And with that perspective in mind, I'd like to now turn to Edith and Noor. Edith, you're the founder of Women Without Borders. We'd like to hear from you how the GCTF could strengthen its network and build new partnership at regional, national, but also local levels.
I would like to thank GCTF for including me in this discussion, and I would congratulate GCTF for the achievements over the last decade. It is a short period of time in which GCTF has convened an impressive network of key PCV players globally. These players span government institutions, international organizations, academic experts, and think tanks alike. I think this is in itself a great exercise. Now, in order, and I thank you for the question, how you can strengthen the networks and build new partnerships. I think this is the way forward for the next decade. So in order for GCTF to build on this unique platform they have created, I see an unprecedented opportunity for GCTF and the global PCV community alike to initiate a global mapping exercise of all existing organizations, and I emphasize existing organizations and individuals alike at the international, regional, and local levels who are already working in and contributing to the space. So the idea would be to identify and understand how and what they contribute, and most importantly, how all these bodies relate to each other. This exercise allows us to identify gaps in the relationships and gaps in players. There are definitely missing players out there. This also allows us to strengthen and build upon existing partnerships and relationships. For example, there are very few women-focused organizations in PCB. By doing this mapping, this would enable us to connect and strengthen relationships with existing organizations by exchanging expertise and, I think most importantly, to forge new partnerships. So what would it look like in practice? And I have a proposition to make. GCTF could build an interactive, digitalized map that is open access to all key players from the international to the grassroots level. This map would feature and highlight the relationships between bodies and would also enable GCTF to take the initiative to forge and to encourage existing and new relationships. So as new players come into the field, GCTF could act as a review board for new actors in the PCBE landscape. I think this would be really a new way forward, or, I mean, hard work, but a worthwhile journey. And I would highly encourage you to consider the suggestion at times when we need coordinated multilateral solutions to address this ongoing threat. GCTF could provide an invaluable resource and has the clout and the international recognition to bring this to life. So I would like to underscore GCTF's leadership in the space of PCBA by embarking on this very concrete suggestion and exercise.
Thanks for the concrete recommendation, Edith. I think this is interesting, and it speaks to also a point raised by Eric about how this space has become crowded and how important it is to understand who does what, how, and where, with what kind of resources. The way in which the GCTF multiple resources, and I have in mind here framework documents, tools, but also manual, the way in which these are used is key. And I'd like to turn to Noor, who is the founder of the Institute for International Peacebuilding, to ask you, Noor, how these resources have been useful to your work.
First of all, thank you for GCTF for having me here, and also for you, and congratulate for GCTF for this massive contribution within 10 years. To answer your questions, I need to also position myself with the issue. I'm a hybrid coming from a former myself. I used to be part of this viral network, and then through process, I've become a peace activist and a scholar in making, and also filmmaker. So GCTF, especially looking at the manual, has been very helpful to me, because when I started off my Institute for Peacebuilding, people are a bit skeptical of my work, because I give second chance to former convicted terrorists, whom Indonesian public generally know that I used to be part of the network myself. But using GCTF as my platform, as my guidance, especially on the good practices, more specifically on the Rome recommendation, the need to engage with the prisoners for release terrorists, this give them second chance, and then the notion of preventions, I'm feeling very pleased. And to add to the recommendation from previous speakers, I think GCTF has been wonderful as an international platform to facilitate multilateral cooperations. But in the end of the day, those recommendations should be embraced by all members of state, not only all members of state, but into very low, the most hyper-local community levels. So informed by this guideline, I've been embarking a number of initiatives, especially in Indonesia, preparing the local community to accept the release terrorists and even return ISIS fighter to integrate into society using specifically GCTF guideline, which is, I feel very comfortable talking to many of my stakeholders, both Indonesian government and donor agency, not only in Indonesia, not regionally, but also globally. I'm using GCTF. So I'm very grateful with this. But as again, for the general public, especially the Indonesian community and also regionally here in Southeast Asia to embrace this, I document each processes of my community engagement with what I so-called credible voice, turn it into film. So within when the film finished, I also make it into a book, like a manuals book, and also that general public can actually access. Today, what I feel grateful is that my controversial approach, giving my former friend second chance, not only become mainstream, but it is now a still challenging initiative, but people kind of accept and provide positive responses. This is, I think, I'm super grateful having GCTF, especially reading your good practices and the manuals, and constantly invited in number of discussion, not only with non-state actors, but also state actors.
It's actually very interesting to see and to hear the details of how you've been using these tools. I can't help but ask now the impact of using GCTF tool on your work, and you've started discussing it, but I feel like we want to hear more.
Well, I mean, like, of course, only to the donors, I told them that I'm adopted GCTF, but for the local community, they don't know that this is part of the GCTF. And because it become a film, become a story, even now, local government asked me, even the governor of Central Java want to be part of the film project, part of the book project, the manual project, without knowing that this is part of GCTF initiative. So we can see the community ownership, because we created a story. Because the problem in Indonesia, terrorism is still seen as the the Indonesian will tell to call it as the conspiracy West against Islam. Very little ownership, but in reality, is many of the victim, in fact, is Muslim themselves. And then because in Indonesian context, those terrorist groups, namely Jamaah Islamiyah and Jamaah Ansarud Daulah, has a very deep root in our nation building, you know. So when they use the word jihad, for instance, people immediately can remember that this very word jihad was used by our early founding fathers to expel the colonialists. So therefore, even after today, you know, after 20 years of, after 9/11, you know, 20 years we are fighting against this group, we keep seeing how the group metamorph, and they are more embraced into more so-called culture. Before, it is easy for the Indonesian government to arrest them because they are linked to a specific group. So in academic term, we call them as a collective action. Individual join to a group like JI or Al-Qaeda linked group, then they become a terrorist. But today, you see a massive shift moving from collective actions into connective actions. You only connect with an idea through social media, then people join terrorist group. So therefore, we are seeing unassuming individual become terrorists, including migrant worker, for instance, or Indonesian overseas, which is really, really disturbing. Therefore, I use a credible voice. Those who have been through this, you know, like return ISIS fighter who disenchanted. I make the documentary on this and being screened globally to show the lies of ISIS using credible voice, because now we are still struggling to embrace this. This is our issue. They still think this is the Western issue, this is the security issue. So the perspective is still state security, not human security. You know?
Thanks very much for this, Noor. And obviously the issue of human security is key, and I think is perhaps the lens through which a lot of those issues should be looked at. But what you're saying is also a good reminder of the fact that although terrorism is a global issue, local contexts matter, and it's important to contextualize our analysis and our responses. And I think the examples you're giving speak to that directly. Since the issue of the local context matters, and building on what Edith has just mentioned in terms of strengthening network and building new partnerships, I'd like to turn back to Edith again to ask her how the impact of the GCTF could be increased at local, at national, but also at regional level.
I think that the GCTF in that respect is extremely important because it gives credibility at all levels, of course, at state level, to deal with this very controversial, delicate issue of violent extremism and terrorism, but particularly at the grassroots levels, where people are really afraid of getting involved in this space, you know, to become actors, to become leaders. This is not easy. We can see this in our work now, which is spanning 12 countries, 3 continents. We mobilize partners on the ground, mainly women who are in the closest nexus and have the closest experience and access to these issues. So the role of GCTF in that respect and the impact GCTF can have is being a facilitator between bodies. And this will not, of course, not only empower GCTF, but it will particularly empower actors within the framework to seek cooperation, create dialogue, and build an expertise, build on expertise. So I think it's this message, you're not alone out there. We are there, you have a framework, you are embedded in an international effort, in an international strategy. This is of utmost importance. And the civil society actors are very proud to be part of this movement. And looking at GCTF and this endeavor across 30 countries and beyond, certain governments and beyond, I think there is really power which can translate into driving force on the ground by local actors. So by being this facilitator, GCTF will also support organizations to identify gaps in the PCV landscape that can be filled. I think this is now extremely important. Moving forward into the next decade, we can't continue business as usual. Of course, we continue good practices, but we have to upgrade our practices. And I think this conversation shows that GCTF is also eager to do this. So more importantly, this exercise will allow existing and new players to ensure that they do not duplicate efforts. Coming back to Eric's remark, it's a crowded space, yes, of course. So we must ensure the quality of the work. It is critical work, it is work which is taken on at high risk sometimes by local actors. So we have to make sure that efforts are done in an appropriate way. And this way forward, by creating this suggested organogram, for example, would create a sustainable impact by allowing our PCE community to address and adapt to new emerging threats our world is facing today. And I mean, we need to think of Afghanistan and beyond, of course, and probably certainly there are new threats ahead. And we need to allow new players to come into the space. So again, I encourage GCTF to consider this endeavor to create an extensive and inclusive map of all key players and stakeholders that could be a roadmap forward and onwards. I think this is really necessary for the international community, for the grassroots community to do this work together in an interactive spirit. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Edith, for this. Ladies and gentlemen, dear participants, this is now the time where we can engage with contributions from the floor. Obviously, questions, but also suggestions and recommendations can be put in the chat. So I would encourage everyone to do so. And we have a first question from China. The question is, what kind of efforts could GCTF make in the next decade to help developing countries to further strengthen their capacity building in counterterrorism? A follow-up question to that is how could GCTF further support the central role of the UN in international counterterrorism cooperations? I feel that these questions would perhaps be directed best to Eric and David, starting perhaps with David.
Thank you, Laurie. I'll try together with Eric to answer the questions. How could the GCTF strengthen the central role of the UN? I think it already does a lot of that. The GCTF is committed in its founding document and in every document I see to supporting the work of the UN. The GCTF is not focused on capacity building, but I could think of two ways in which the GCTF can support capacity building. First, the GCTF includes most of the major donor countries. And the UN, as you know, and China, of course, is a major donor as well, relies heavily on its donors to be able to build capacity of member states. So there is an opportunity here for GCTF members to support the work of the UN and support the work of the GCTF by insisting on, first, that GCTF, that UN capacity building programs embed GCTF good practices, and since the UN is usually deeply involved in the elaboration, it's fairly easy. And second, insist that the development of the GCTF tool are expanding UN instruments and not contradicting them or creating a potential difficulty for the UN to promote them. I'm not suggesting that this is the case, but this is something that I think GCTF members and co-chairs of working group need to be able to pay attention to, that the tools they're developing are actually supporting, complementing, and expanding the UN instruments and not deviating from them. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Eric, would you like to add anything to that and to these two questions from China?
Yes, certainly. I think on the second question about how to strengthen the UN, I think 10 years ago when the GCTF was created, one of the objectives was to give a boost to implementation of the UN Global Counterterrorism Strategy on the ground, in part because the UN itself was rather scattered on that issue. I think in the ability to support countries on the ground. I think obviously it's very different today. The UN is everywhere on counterterrorism now. And I think the GCTF would actually be better positioned not so much to focus on its relationship with the UN, which is very strong and very mature, but actually to turn towards the field and focus much more on building relationships with regional organizations and local actors, which would get to the answer to the first question from China, which is how the GCTF can better support capacity building in the global south, and I think in developing countries. And I think that is the key here, is working much more closely with regional organizations and then local NGOs, local actors, and local governments. I think that is something where the GCTF could develop a comparative advantage and maybe also get at this issue of translating global good practice into local action more. The last point I'd make here is, I think the GCTF, again, this gets to the first question from China, the GCTF should consider moving away from simply developing global good practices that are hopefully going to have applicability to every country around the world. Instead, move towards maybe more regionally focused good practices that emerge from the regional working groups, from consultations with local actors and regional organizations, and are much more tailored for the specific region. And again, that's something that would be different from what the UN typically does and what other multilateral organizations typically do. So again, it would be again, a comparative advantage that the GCTF could begin to leverage.
Thanks very much, Eric, for this. I think it's very key and also speaks to the importance of seeing things from local or regional perspective. It would be great to hear from the co-chairs of the various regional groups what they think about the importance of developing regionally focused good practices. I do encourage participants to continue engaging and asking questions directly in the chat. I think I'm being told that for now there are no additional questions, but I think it would be a good moment to focus our conversation on recommendations, and a couple very strong recommendations have already been put forward by Edith and by David, and also by Eric. But if we had to come out of this panel with perhaps a synthesis of what it is we want to address for the next decade, and what it is we would like to make sure is being done properly, and what could be a key recommendation for the GCTF to take on board during the next decade. And I'll go around our four panelists to engage on that, perhaps their analysis of the biggest challenge lying ahead, and the key recommendation for the GCTF to take on board. Who would like to go first? Well, I'll designate someone then, and I'll go towards Noor.
Okay. I think to me there are two things that I have been working and try, because this is the trend that will continue to emerge. Which is, first, we need to look at also the role of technology. We need to incorporate, because before social media, our threat is kind of manageable. We know this is more offline side, but now with the social media, with the internet, we are seeing different level of threat. So we need to incorporate how can we use technology as well to tackle this issue. Secondly, also we need to ponder seriously the role of gender. What I mean the role of gender here, not only the role of woman, but also the role of how these radical groups or violence group exploit the very construction of masculinity and also femininity. Because radicalization is never gender neutral. The reason for in, stay, and out is also very gender. And we tend to look at this process genderless. So I think there are two things that we need to take seriously in the next 10 years to come. And therefore, I fully agree with Edith. We need to identify who does what so we can learn each other. I fully agree that there is no one size fits for all, but at least lesson learned from each country is very important with a context specific. Context specific is very important. Going back to the question from China, I think the issue of terrorism is not only in the developing countries, but also in the developed world as well. Because violent extremism is not okay. Poverty plays an important role, but it's not the root causes of it.
I think what you're saying, Noor, is key. And at the ISS, we recently finalized a study looking at women involvement in Katiba Masina in central Mali and Boko Haram in eastern Niger. And I think what I take out of this study is precisely the fact that terrorist organization will include or exclude certain men and certain women based on specific strategic needs and objectives. And I think it's important to see the gender dimension, not just in terms of women or men, but in terms of what specific roles and dynamics these groups are trying to generate in the process. And there's definitely a lot that is already known now, but still that remains unknown, and that could help elaborating relevant policies and responses. Thanks very much for these points. Can I now turn to Eric for his biggest challenges lying ahead and key recommendation that the GCTF should take on board for the next decade?
Thank you. I think rather than limiting myself to one, I'll offer a few. I think one is really strengthening its cooperation with the inspired institutions, which surprisingly haven't gotten any mentioned today. And I think they're the most impactful contributions that the GCTF has made to the multilateral counterterrorism and countering violence extremism space. So we're talking about the IIJ, GCERF, and Hedaya, and really making them much more integral parts of the GCTF operation and catalysts for implementation of local good practices at a local level, and not just sort of in an ad hoc fashion, but in a much more systematic fashion, where different organizations, different inspired institutions are taking more ownership over the implementation process and actually providing some, accounting of impact vis-a-vis implementation of the good practices. The second would be what I've already said, is developing more regionally focused good practices that are not necessarily the idea of a GCTF member sitting in the donor capital that they then try to get consensus on at the GCTF and then push down, but actually emerge organically from the regional working groups, for example. What do the countries in the region think they need guidance on, and then how can the GCTF help develop that guidance consistent with the international human rights standards, et cetera, but it should be much more organically developed than is currently the case. And then the third recommendation would be that the world and the sort of the multilateral counterterrorism space is littered with all these different organizations. One thing that could set the GCTF apart is its ability to be multidisciplinary, multi-actor in its approach at every level. And this means more consistently involving civil society and local government representatives at the table on a regular basis. And I think that would create a much more dynamic platform. And I think also the ability to look not just at new counterterrorism challenges, which of course it will continue to do, but look at how the counterterrorism issues are more and more being considered as part of a wider set of threats, different forms of violence, different forms of conflict, and see how the GCTF can actually start articulating some good practices in that uncharted space and how this intersection can work in practice. And I think those three areas are where the GCTF can make a real difference and distinguish it a bit more from its big brother at the UN to celebrate the 20th anniversary with even more pomp and circumstance that it celebrated the 10th.
Thanks, Eric, for this. I think these are also very powerful points that you're making forward. And the issue of documenting good practices, I think, is an important one. And although it is often implied, I feel like it's important to also unpack the fact that documenting and discussing bad practices is perhaps just as important. I see very few actors actually inclined to discuss about what they've tried, which has abysmally failed, and why. People like to talk about what they did that was great, but I think we have lots to learn about what has actually not worked in specific contexts, because that's the only way to make sure we actually do not reproduce mistakes. And I think this is something that it's also important to highlight, and something we're trying to work on at the ISS as we engage with coastal countries in a context of the extending threat of violent extremist groups from the Sahel towards the coast. And it's actually much more complicated to document those bad practices because very few actors are ready to openly discuss them. I would like to now turn to Edith for her remarks as to what are the key challenges that she sees, and perhaps an additional recommendation that she would like to put forward. Over to you, Edith.
follow up on your suggestion, which I think is really crucial to focus on what has not worked and bad practices. So in order to achieve in these unpredictable times, in times of high fragility, we all feel it now, this world we're living in and moving in is very confusing. Of course, we need to join efforts. We need to strengthen ties, identify the gaps, and identify and define the opportunities for us to address these ever-changing threats. And this was quite clear also in the discussion that the threats are changing and will emerge in different ways. And we don't know yet. We only have a faint idea of maybe. But to understand, to also look at the bad practices and what has not worked, we have to understand our own shortcomings. What did we not address? For example, not including women at the table in policy making or in intervention strategies, or making sure that local efforts are led by women organized entities and NGOs is a big mistake. And it leaves the space open for players who don't work or don't move in the whole of community spirit. So we have to look at an honest whole of community and at an honest whole of community multilateral approach. I think this is what I hope we will do over the next decade. This will certainly be a game changer. And we need to take stock from the grassroots to the policy level to understand whom we have been leaving out in order to build a more impactful PCD architecture. And I think we will have partners in doing this. We just have to address these partners and open the floor for this discussion. And we will have a new emerging community around us who stand together and will work on this. I just would like to make a brief, I would like to bring in a very small example from Austria, where I'm speaking from. We were invited, we civil society stakeholders were invited to work on the security strategy. And we were not only invited to consult, but also invited to co-write it. And this was really changing the cooperation, the interaction, not only between the civil society players, but also the connections, interventions, and dialogue between state players, grassroots players, and of course the strategy has a different fashion. So this is a small example, but I think a powerful example, since strategies are important and consulting with all members of community societies is an important sign that we take this work seriously and everybody is included and invited to contribute.
Thanks very much, Edith. The issue of making sure all actors are around the table, as well as another issue that was raised by Eric earlier about how terrorism connects with a wider number of threats, and we could think of organized crime, we could think of local conflicts, we could think of a lot of additional vulnerabilities. I think this is key, but it also takes us to an issue that is perhaps not discussed enough, and it's the issue of prevention. We mention it in passing when we say PCVE, but clearly, and as we see the threat expanding, I think a lot more effort should also be devoted to the issue of prevention and trying to see how not just containment should be done, but how unresolved other threats and other issues can actually open doors for terrorist groups implementation, recruitment, and expansion. And so the connection of all these threats is definitely something else we could put in terms of a challenge for the next 10 years and something that the GCTF should take on board even more efficiently. Moving to our last panelist now, David, your largest challenges and a key recommendation you would like the GCTF to take on board for the next decade.
I first support all the recommendations that my colleagues to the panel have mentioned. one point of record, there was one mentioning of one of the GCTF-inspired institutions in this panel, and I'm happy to do it again because I really value not only their work, but also their cooperation with us, and that is the IIJ's work on battlefield evidence, which I thought was an excellent example of cooperation. When it comes to recommending the GCTF, I would say the following. The GCTF has become a good practices powerhouse. And every year tackles a new topic and a new domain, very often first among the international actors. A 10 years anniversary, it's a good time to ask about impact and about, I would say, and the question I would pose to myself, had I been a member of the GCTF, is which are our force multipliers, and how do we make sure that the good practices we develop are actually implemented in supporting member states' capacity? So far, I think in this panel, we highlighted a few critical force multipliers, from the UN norm setting role to the UN capacity building role, to partnerships that the GCTF developed with UN entities, GCTF-inspired institutions as a tool of promotion, and as was mentioned more in the last part of this panel, local actors who are could be and should be excellent partners to GCTF working group. The question I have is for the GCTF is this enough? Are all of them used to the maximum benefit of the GCTF good practices and their promulgation and the way they support member states? It's not a bad time to ask this question, and I'm sure the answers will come with a stronger GCTF. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this, David. We are now at the end of this very rich conversation, and I think a lot of key issues have been put on the table. David, Eric, Edith, and Noor, I would like to thank you for all your remarks, your informed remarks, and we can see that all of your comments actually are based on very strong experience at various levels. It was a distinct pleasure for me to moderate this conversation, and I look forward to further opportunities to engage. I will now hand the floor back to the co-chairs.
Thank you very much, Lauriane, and special thanks to Eric, Edith, David, and Noor for your timely assessments and your pertinent recommendations about the forum's work and its impact, and once again to Lauriane for guiding the discussion. You've given us much to reflect on and to consider as the GCTF heads into its second decade. Me personally, I very much take the essential points which we always struggle with in the GCTF, and I think are key to the future, as you've indicated. The question is, what is our impact in the end? Where does that impact happen, and who needs to be involved in this process? And all these were reflected loud and clear, and this is important guidance for us, important questions and considerations for us. So I must say it was a privilege to have you speak to us during this GCTF Coordinating Committee meeting. We very much look forward to further interactions with you and to a future GCTF activity where we might be able to exchange with you in person de vive voix. So thank you. Stay safe, stay well, and we hope to see you again soon.